Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dissenter Weekly update for June 11th, 2020. I'm Kevin Gosztola, the managing editor for Shadowproof.com, and it's good to be back after taking a week off. We have several whistleblower stories to get through today that tie into what has happened with protests against police brutality over the last 2 weeks. But first, don't forget to hit the red subscribe button below the video to follow our show, and remember that Shadowproof is a 100% reader-funded and supported website. Our ability to do this show depends on your financial support. If you would like to help us sustain the show and grow as an organization, please check out our donation and membership options, which are at shadowproof.com/donate. Again, shadowproof.com/donate. So to begin, the first story for today is about an officer in Buffalo, New York. In 2006, Cariol Horne says she saw Gregory Kwiatkowski, a white colleague of hers in the Buffalo Police Department, choke a black man named Neil Mack. She alleged that he dragged Mack out of his home, and then Horne tried to intervene, and Kwiatkowski punched Horne in the mouth. Horne was fired from the Buffalo Police Department. When the world reacted to Buffalo cops pushing over the 75-year-old peace activist Martin Gugino, who fell on his head and bled on the ground, she watched officers stop anyone from intervening. And naturally, it reminded her of what happened back in 2006. Horne has been joining the protests. She's been out there fighting for justice for George Floyd and for others who are survivors or murdered by police. She wants a law to be passed called Cariol's Law in Buffalo that would hopefully help protect officers like anyone like her who witnesses police officers engaging in abuse or brutality. She told a local radio station, quote, "None of those officers should have stood by and watched him die," referring to George Floyd. And she added, "You don't stay on someone's neck for 9 minutes and expect them to live after that. It was straight up murder. And because they didn't stop it, that was a problem." Now, let's take a moment to explore her story a bit further, because one key aspect of police contracts can involve limiting rewards to whistleblowers, police whistleblowers, and or encouraging what is known as the quote-unquote blue wall of silence. And since I think this is a underreported, undercovered aspect of what we're seeing throughout the country, it's important to highlight some of these examples of police whistleblowers that have come forward. And I think through the rest of the summer, we'll look to bring out some of these stories so that you can see more of these systemic issues that exist within these departments when it comes to trying to hold killer cops or abusive cops accountable. So when Horne reported what happened to the department, she received no support. She had no video, and none of the officers who witnessed what happened were willing to corroborate her story during arbitration. She lost her pension. Horne was also sued for defamation by the white police officer she challenged, and was found guilty of this defamation. And later, she was evicted from her home in Buffalo and complained that the city would not let her daughter make payments on her rent on her behalf. And so the public in New York, in a report written by Aaron Lowinger, detailed what happened to Horne even further and what happened specifically to Kwiatkowski, who committed more abuse after this incident in 2006. In 2009, Kwiatkowski, along with 2 other officers, confiscated a BB gun from a group of teens and handcuffed them in the car and shot at them with the same BB gun, striking one youth in the leg and groin. In 2011, Kwiatkowski, then a lieutenant, chose to retire when he was facing an internal investigation into an incident in which he grabbed another fellow officer by the neck in retaliation for that officer's request to be placed elsewhere in the force, away from Kwiatkowski. Further, according to this report that was written by Lowinger, Kwiatkowski was charged earlier in 2016 on a DWI charge, on DWI charges stemming from an ATV event in an area nearby Buffalo. Washington Post says that Kwiatkowski rammed the heads of 4 handcuffed teenagers into a police car, and that's what happened during this BB gun incident. He's now serving a prison sentence, but that happened after more people were hurt. A local radio station spoke to Horne, and she had this to say: "Speaking out against police brutality has definitely put me in a situation, and that officer is now incarcerated because he took a plea on federal charges and also testified in court that he lied during the hearing, which he also lied in mine. So when he gets out, he still has the pension, and I don't." And she was bringing up several issues there. The fact that he's going to be able to essentially retire from the force like nothing happened, because he's still going to have all the benefits that he would have had if he just left the force. But meanwhile, Horne doesn't have those benefits, and also she's never had her claims validated in Buffalo. So part of her efforts, her continued efforts for justice, are also about making sure that people believe her story. And so getting this law where you would force officers to have to intervene would mean that what she's gone through for more than a decade is actually acknowledged, and the struggle that she's gone through is recognized by city officials in Buffalo, New York. So let's continue on to the next story, which highlights something that is a case from 2015. And given events, we're going to revisit this. It involves Lorenzo Davis, who was on the Independent Police Review Authority, or IPRA. This was the authority, or the supposed oversight board that existed before Laquan McDonald was killed, shot 16 times by Jason Van Dyke, this white police officer who was sentenced to prison for murdering Laquan McDonald, a black teenager. And Lorenzo Davis was awarded $2.8 million by a court after he alleged that he was fired for refusing to change findings that officers were responsible for shootings which were unjustified. And this was covered by WBEZ, which is a local radio station in Chicago, where I'm based. So let's just read what WBEZ had to say about this case back in 2015, which is that Scott M. Ando, the chief administrator of the city's Independent Police Review Authority, informed its staff in an email that the agency no longer employed supervising investigator Lorenzo Davis, who was a former Chicago police commander. Davis's termination came less than 2 weeks after top IPRA officials evaluating Davis's job performance accused him of a clear bias against the police. So I should put that in quotes, quote, "a clear bias against the police." WBEZ additionally reported that these IPRA officials called him the only supervisor, this is another quote, "the only supervisor at IPRA who resists making requested changes as directed by management in order to reflect the correct finding." And so essentially they had told him that you weren't going to find that these so-called officer-involved shootings were unjustified, and he would not alter his findings. Davis stated that the CPD has shot people dead when they did not have to shoot. They were not in reasonable fear for their lives. The evidence shows that the officer knew or should have known that the person who they shot was not armed or did not pose a threat to them, or could have been apprehended by means short of deadly force. But now he remains in this legal battle because back in February, an appeals court completely slashed his reward. The award that was granted to him was slashed, and the foreperson who is in this Cook County jury, which is the county that Chicago is in, eliminated all but $100,000 of this $2 million award that was granted to Lorenzo Davis, which was to go towards emotional distress from his 2015 dismissal. The foreperson was upset and spoke to WBZ back in February, saying that, quote, they just disregarded 2 weeks of work that us jurors went through. We wanted to find what is right for this individual, and then it was overturned by an appeals court. It angers me. In the 8 years of existence, IPRA had never found an on-duty shooting by an officer to be unjustified, yet Davis was someone who was actually challenging this culture and challenging this culture of cops being able to get away with murder, while someone who was running this agency was what you could call a company man, or someone who the police in Chicago could depend upon. Endo was a former federal drug agent that was appointed to the position by Rahm Emanuel, who was Chicago mayor. And so this is important. And Davis had succeeded under the Illinois Whistleblowers Act to get a reward. But then the culture, it seems, of protecting police and not wanting to have a kind of precedent that would embolden police to come forward appears to have led to the slashing of this award despite his good work. And so continuing on, the next story that we have is actually a current one happening that was recently covered in the Albuquerque Journal. And it's about a whistleblower lawsuit that was filed in the Second Judicial District Court in New Mexico. And former detectives Sally Dyer, Teresa Romero, and Mandy Abernathy say that they were retaliated against when they repeatedly raised concern about the way that the sex crimes unit was run in their department. And this is important because right now, as we have a conversation about police reform, a lot of people are having conversations about what would happen if we defunded police. And they're invoking the fact that rapes and potentially murders might not be handled properly, and that we might have more rapes and murders. And this is showing that there's already a huge problem in departments and even officers who would take steps that make it hard and difficult to investigate sex crimes. So in effect, making it hard for officers who want to do that job to be able to do this job. So if we're to believe the allegations from these officers, apparently they were told to stop using a database that tracked suspect information, which included the location of an assault, description, and vehicle. And the unit's leadership was, quote unquote, frustrated that the detectives were using a national database created by the FBI. And of course, they're not sure why that was an issue for officers in the department. The lawsuit also says that new detectives were not properly trained, and that Sergeant Amanda Wild, the head of the unit, told detectives not to communicate with prosecutors about cases. So it's kind of bizarre. It's not really outlined in the report as to what the motivations were for preventing people from investigating rapes or not handling rape kits, investigating these sex crimes properly. But this looks like a police whistleblower lawsuit that is at least worth following because they're challenging something that was going on within the department that more than one officer was allowing to take place. And certainly for bringing this lawsuit, those officers which have since resigned from the department could face retaliation in the community as a result of them going after Albuquerque police who were preventing people from doing what they should do, which is to investigate rapes and sex crimes. So we'll continue to follow as that develops. The final story for today, at least I have another thing after this, but what I wanted to highlight here is that the Federal Bureau of Prisons put all of their facilities on lockdown during the George Floyd protests. And Lauren Gill did an excellent report for the appeal that was published on June 3rd. People can go look for more details, but I just wanted to highlight this because it was acknowledged by Billy Winter Davis, who is the mother of Reality Winner. Reality Winner's in the Carswell facility, the medical center for women in Fort Worth, Texas. We've covered her case extensively here and shown her some support. She's pushing an appeal. She's trying to get released because she says that she has a history of respiratory illnesses and is vulnerable to COVID-19. But what happened is while she's been in this facility, like a lot of other facilities, those facilities were put on lockdown because there were officers who were removed from BOP. The kinds of troops that would respond to crises were actually deployed in Washington, D.C. They were unmarked. They were unidentified. They wouldn't tell press why they were deployed to the streets of D.C. to patrol protests or to engage in security to protect the White House. Turned out these were from the Bureau of Prisons. And I think concurrent to all of this, you saw that Federal Bureau of Prisons increased the way that they were going to crack down on prisoners and prevent them from having access to information about what's happening with the protests, limit the sort of acts that people would be able to take in order to show solidarity with people who are out on the streets. Essentially, what BOP did is outlined here as a spokesperson described. In light of extensive protest activity occurring around the country, the BOP is implementing an additional temporary security measure to ensure the good order and security of our institutions. But there wasn't any crisis or any like rioting or anything inside the facilities. It was a proactive move in order to prevent information from getting to prisoners and to cut off people from their families. And even in some facilities, it was reported turned off televisions or even removed televisions at Pekin Camp, which is a minimum security women's facility in Illinois. Lauren Gill reported that officials removed televisions, phones, and video visitation was no longer permitted. They, with lacking all of this, there's no way that they could respond to the moment. And then this was a way for wardens across the country to maintain control of the prisoners by keeping them in the dark. Just a quick update for Reality Winner. There was the anniversary of her arrest since we last had our show, and she was granted expedited appeal for her case, and we're waiting to see arguments move forward, and then the appeals court will rule on whether the district court improperly handled her motion for release when it was filed with the court. And so let's end today's show. What I'd like to bring up here is Frank Serpico, well-known, renowned police whistleblower from New York. Everyone who is a big cinephile and likes movies knows that Al Pacino played him in the Serpico film in the 1970s. He did an interview with foreignpolicy.com on police racism, talking about some of his thoughts about what is happening. And I just wanted to end this show by reading this exchange that took place between Foreign Policy magazine and Frank Serpico. I think someone who has a history of challenging police corruption probably knows pretty well how we should take seriously or not take seriously what politicians are saying in this moment. And I think we look to whistleblowers that have a background in challenging police to not be the only people that provide us direction, but I also think that their voices can be included with what we're hearing from people who are survivors and what we're seeing from organizers and activists on the ground. So Frank was asked about moves for new national legislation. He was asked about Kamala Harris, who has sponsored a bill to include a national police systems review board that could collect data. Harris was again cited because she thinks that the National Transportation Safety Board could be a model for investigating police. And she, described some other aspects of what could be in this legislation. And so in response, Frank Serpico told Foreign Policy. It could be a change, but again, is it the same old rhetoric? Election campaign bullshit. There's a lot of rhetoric out there now. A lot of police chiefs are coming out to cover their asses. Show me the action. As they say, show me the money. Because I've heard the rhetoric for decades. Even on the Knapp Commission, they were worried about their political careers. And I believe this commission was one that Frank Serpico participated in and supported decades ago. He goes on and he says, consider Andrew Cuomo, New York's governor. He comes out and says, quote, I stand with the protesters, end quote, which is a very nice thing. But where the hell were you before this started? He was Attorney General-elect when Sean Bell, a 23-year-old black man from Queens who was shot to death by police at his bachelor party in 2006, got assassinated, and none of the officers were indicted. I think they were arrested, but all got off. This is typical, the combination of an excess of deadly force and near total lack of accountability. As long as they're not unlucky to be videoed by a witness, most cops can still pull out their weapons and fire away without fear that anything will happen to them. All a police officer has to say is that he believes his life was in danger, and he'll usually get away with it. What do you think that does to their psychology as they patrol the streets? The sense of invulnerability. Some of these cops get suspended or dismissed, but they go on to be cops at other venues. And what does that mean? To be suspended or put on leave with pay. That's not punishment. That's a reward. So that has to change. There are so many aspects that have to be changed. Right now, the cops are in the driver's seat, and the citizens are being ridden roughshod over. And in the end, you just can't have anybody involved with the police doing these investigations. The fox cannot watch the hen house. This is what I found. I'm a graduate of John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Most of the professors there are ex-police officials. They write their books, and none of them will be very critical of the police agency. One example is James Fife, the former deputy police commissioner of training at the New York Police Academy, who defended Diallo's killers, Amadou Diallo. In his book, Above the Law, which was required reading at law class at Columbia University, he also falsified the evidence in my shooting to absolve the cops. Even today, I am persona non grata in the NYPD. Patrick Murphy, who was police commissioner at the time, wrote in his book that I shouldn't have been promoted. And so, there's just a little flavor of how cops treat whistleblowers and this culture of challenging people who come out publicly and talk about the way policing works in this country. If you even acknowledge the way it perpetuates systemic racism, then you get erased from history, you lose your pension, you no longer are able to be a part of the community. They'll try to isolate and cast you out from the community. This is what happens to police whistleblowers. And as we move forward, as the response to George Floyd's murder and the push for defunding police or abolishing police or making police more obsolete in this country continues, we'll highlight stories like this of police whistleblowers so that you can see the important risks and sacrifices that some of these officers are choosing to make as they recognize what they've been tasked with doing against communities. With that said, I thank you for watching this show. Again, as we said at the beginning, if you like what you're seeing and if you would like to keep this show going, I encourage you to go to shadowproof.com/donate, shadowproof.com/donate and support this show. We'll be back next week with another episode.